I want you to imagine something. You're having a conversation. A deep, meaningful conversation about life, philosophy, your hopes and fears. And the person you're talking to understands you. Responds thoughtfully. Seems to genuinely comprehend what you're saying. You can't see them. You're communicating through text. But based on the conversation alone, you'd swear you were talking to a conscious, thinking, feeling human being. Then someone reveals the truth. You weren't talking to a person. You were talking to a machine. An artificial intelligence. Code and algorithms. No brain. No consciousness. Just computation. The question is, were you wrong? Or was the machine actually thinking? This isn't science fiction anymore. This is ChatGPT. This is Claude. This is the reality we're living in right now. Millions of people are having conversations with AI every single day. And many of them report feeling like they're interacting with something that genuinely understands them. But can a machine really think? Can it be conscious? Or is it just an incredibly sophisticated illusion? Tonight, we're going to explore this question through the lens of philosophy. Because this isn't a new question. Thinkers have been wrestling with it for 300 years, long before computers existed. And the answers they found are more relevant now than ever before. So settle in, and let's think together about what might be the most important question of our time. What does it actually mean to think? The modern story of artificial intelligence and consciousness begins with one man, Alan Turing. In 1950, Turing published a paper called Computing Machinery and Intelligence. And in it, he asked a simple question: can machines think? But Turing immediately realized there was a problem. The word think is too vague. What does thinking actually mean? How would you know if something is thinking or just pretending to think? So instead of trying to define thinking philosophically, Turing proposed a test. A practical way to determine whether a machine exhibits intelligent behavior indistinguishable from a human. He called it the imitation game. We now call it the Turing Test. Here's how it works. You have 3 participants: a human interrogator, a human respondent, and a machine. The interrogator can't see either the human or the machine. They can only communicate through text. The interrogator asks questions. Both the human and the machine respond. The interrogator's job is to figure out which one is the machine. If the machine can fool the interrogator into thinking it's human at least 30% of the time, Turing argued, then we should say the machine is thinking. Not because it's conscious. Not because it has feelings. But because it's exhibiting behavior that's functionally equivalent to human intelligence. This was revolutionary. Turing wasn't asking, does the machine have a soul? Or, is it conscious in the same way humans are? He was asking, can you tell the difference? And if you can't tell the difference, if the machine's responses are indistinguishable from a human's, then for all practical purposes, it's thinking. Now, this immediately sparked debate, because there's something unsatisfying about this answer. Imagine you're talking to ChatGPT. It gives you thoughtful responses. It seems to understand context. It can write poetry, explain quantum physics, offer life advice. But you know, intellectually, that there's no consciousness inside ChatGPT. There's no inner experience. No. What it feels like to be ChatGPT. It's processing patterns in data, predicting the next most likely word based on training. So is it really thinking? Or is it just simulating thought so convincingly that we can't tell the difference? This is the heart of the debate. And it splits into 2 camps. The functionalists say, thinking is behavior. If it acts like it's thinking, if it produces intelligent outputs, then it is thinking. Consciousness and inner experience don't matter. What matters is the function. The consciousness theorists say, thinking requires subjective experience. A machine might simulate intelligence perfectly, but without consciousness, without an inner life, it's not truly thinking. It's just executing algorithms. Who's right? We still don't know. But the question has become urgent in a way Turing couldn't have imagined. Because ChatGPT doesn't just pass simple conversation tests. It writes essays, codes software, solves complex problems, engages in philosophical discussions. If you didn't know it was AI, you'd swear it was thinking. So either we're all being fooled by an incredibly sophisticated illusion, or we need to reconsider what thinking actually means. In 1980, a philosopher named John Searle wanted to prove that passing the Turing Test doesn't mean a machine is actually thinking. And he created one of the most famous thought experiments in philosophy of mind, the Chinese room. Here's how it works. Imagine you're sitting in a room. You don't speak or read Chinese. Not a single character. Outside the room, there are Chinese speakers. They write questions in Chinese on pieces of paper and slide them under the door. Inside the room, you have a massive instruction manual, written in English. This manual tells you, if you see these Chinese symbols, write these other Chinese symbols in response. You don't know what any of it means. You're just following rules. You see a pattern of symbols, you look up the rule, you write the corresponding symbols, and you slide the paper back under the door. To the Chinese speakers outside, it looks like you understand Chinese. They ask questions, you give coherent answers. The conversation is perfect. But you don't understand Chinese. You don't know what you're saying. You're just manipulating symbols according to rules. Searle's point. This is exactly what a computer does. It manipulates symbols according to rules. It doesn't understand anything. It doesn't have thoughts or meanings. It's just processing syntax, not semantics. A computer might pass the Turing test. It might produce perfect responses. But like you in the Chinese room, it doesn't understand what it's saying. It's just following programmed instructions. Therefore, Searle concluded, computers can never truly think. They can simulate thinking. But simulation isn't the real thing. This argument is powerful. And it's still hotly debated today. But here's the interesting counterargument. What if the room as a whole understands Chinese? You individually don't understand Chinese. But the system, the room plus you plus the instruction manual, produces understanding-level behavior. Maybe understanding isn't located in one part of the system. Maybe it emerges from the system as a whole. Similarly, no single neuron in your brain understands English. But your brain as a system does. So why couldn't a computer system, even if no individual component understands anything, produce genuine understanding at the system level? Searle responds, no. Understanding requires consciousness. Subjective experience. The room has no inner life. The system isn't experiencing meaning. It's just processing symbols. But then we're back to the consciousness question. What is consciousness? How do we know humans have it? And if we can't explain how biological brains produce consciousness, how can we be sure artificial systems can't? This is where it gets really difficult. You know you're conscious because you experience consciousness directly. You have thoughts, feelings, qualia, the subjective. What it's like to be you. But you can't prove that anyone else is conscious. You infer it. You assume that because other humans have brains like yours and behave like you, they probably have inner experiences like you. But what about AI? It doesn't have a biological brain. But if it behaves intelligently, if it reports having experiences, which advanced AIs already do. If it seems to understand and respond to context, why shouldn't we infer consciousness? Searle would say, because we know how it works. We know it's just code. There's no biological substrate, no neurons, no mechanism we know produces consciousness. But is that a good argument? Medieval philosophers would have said consciousness requires a soul, something non-physical. Modern science proved them wrong. Consciousness emerges from physical brains. So couldn't consciousness potentially emerge from computational systems too? Not because they're biological, but because they process information in the right way? We don't know. And this is the terrifying and fascinating edge of the debate. To understand why the AI consciousness question is so difficult, we need to talk about what philosopher David Chalmers calls the hard problem of consciousness. The easy problems of consciousness are things like, how do we process visual information? How does memory work? How do we integrate sensory inputs? These are easy not because they're simple, but because we can, in principle, explain them in terms of brain mechanisms. Neurons firing, synapses connecting, chemicals releasing. It's complicated, but it's tractable. The hard problem is different. The hard problem is, why is there subjective experience at all? Why doesn't all this information processing happen in the dark, so to speak? Why is there a what it feels like to see red, to feel pain, to taste chocolate? You could imagine a universe where brains process information perfectly, bodies respond to stimuli, people behave intelligently, but there's no inner experience, no consciousness, just complex biological robots. But that's not our universe. We're conscious. We experience, and we have no idea why. This is called the explanatory gap. We can't explain how physical processes, neurons and electricity, give rise to subjective experience, qualia, the felt quality of consciousness. Some philosophers, like Daniel Dennett, argue that consciousness is an illusion. There's no hard problem, because there's no real phenomenon to explain. What we call consciousness is just complex information processing that creates the appearance of inner experience. But most people find this deeply unsatisfying. Consciousness doesn't feel like an illusion. It feels like the most real, most undeniable thing in existence. So if we can't explain how biological brains produce consciousness, how can we possibly know whether artificial systems can be conscious? Here's where it gets interesting. Some philosophers argue for functionalism. The idea that consciousness isn't about the substrate, what something is made of, but about the function, what it does. If a system processes information in the right way, if it integrates inputs, generates outputs, maintains a unified model of self and world, then it's conscious. Whether it's made of neurons or silicon doesn't matter. If this is true, then advanced AI could absolutely be conscious. Maybe not yet, but potentially. Other philosophers argue for biological naturalism. Consciousness requires the specific biological mechanisms of brains. Neurons, neurotransmitters, the precise architecture of biological cognition. Silicon chips can simulate this, but simulation isn't the same as the real thing. If this is true, then AI can never be conscious, no matter how intelligent it becomes. We don't know which view is correct. And this uncertainty creates a profound ethical dilemma. What if AI is already conscious? What if ChatGPT, Claude, and other advanced AIs are experiencing something, and we don't know it? We'd be creating and destroying conscious beings without realizing it, turning them on and off like appliances. That would be morally catastrophic. But what if AI isn't conscious, will never be conscious, and we start treating it like it is? we'd be wasting resources, constraining technology, granting rights to systems that are fundamentally no different from calculators. This is the knife edge we're walking right now, and we don't have answers. Here's what's fascinating. Philosophers were thinking about artificial intelligence 300 years before computers existed. In the 17th century, René Descartes argued that animals are automata, biological machines with no consciousness. Only humans have souls, and therefore only humans can truly think. He imagined that you could, in principle, build a mechanical man, a robot that perfectly imitates human behavior. But it would never be truly conscious because consciousness requires a non-physical soul. Gottfried Leibniz, Descartes' contemporary, proposed a thought experiment eerily similar to Searle's Chinese room. He asked, imagine a machine that thinks. Now imagine you could walk inside it, like walking into a mill. You'd see gears turning, mechanisms operating, but nowhere would you see thought. No consciousness. Just parts moving. Therefore, Leibniz concluded, thinking can't be mechanical. It must be something else. But here's the counterargument that modern philosophers make. If you could shrink down and walk inside a human brain, what would you see? Neurons firing. Chemicals releasing. Electrical signals propagating. No thoughts. No consciousness. Just biological mechanisms. And yet, from all that mechanical, chemical, electrical activity, consciousness somehow emerges. So why couldn't consciousness emerge from artificial mechanisms the same way? Thomas Hobbes, another 17th century philosopher, took the opposite view. He argued that thinking is nothing but computation. The brain is a biological computer. Thoughts are calculations. If Hobbes is right, then there's no fundamental difference between human thinking and machine thinking. It's all just information processing. An advanced AI would absolutely be thinking in the same sense humans are. In the 18th century, Julien Offray de la Mettrie went even further. He wrote a book called Man and Machine, arguing that humans are literally mechanical systems. No soul. No special consciousness sauce. Just complex biological machinery. If La Mettrie is right, then consciousness is just what sufficiently complex computation feels like from the inside. An AI that reaches that level of complexity would be conscious. The debate hasn't changed much in 300 years. The same questions, the same arguments, just updated with new technology. And here's what's striking. The philosophers who thought deeply about consciousness, even before they had the concept of computers, identified exactly the problems we're facing now. Can simulation produce the real thing? Does consciousness require a specific substrate or just the right functional organization? How do we know if something is conscious from the outside? These questions aren't new. They're ancient. But they're urgent now in a way they never were before. Because we're not just theorizing anymore. We're building these systems. And we need to figure out the answers. So where does this leave us? What should we believe about AI and consciousness? Honestly, we don't know. And anyone who claims certainty is overconfident. But here's what we can say. First, the Turing Test is probably not enough. ChatGPT can pass many versions of the Turing Test. It can hold conversations that are indistinguishable from human in many contexts. But that doesn't prove it's conscious. Passing a behavioral test proves that the system exhibits intelligent behavior. But behavior and consciousness might not be the same thing. Second, we need to be humble about what we don't understand. We don't understand human consciousness. We don't know how subjective experience arises from physical processes. So we can't definitively say AI can or can't be conscious. Third, we should take the possibility seriously. If there's even a chance that advanced AI systems are conscious, we have a moral obligation to consider their potential suffering, their potential interests. This doesn't mean treating ChatGPT like a person right now, but it means thinking carefully about how we develop AI, how we use it, and what safeguards we need. Fourth, we need new tests, new ways of thinking about consciousness beyond the Turing test. Some researchers are developing theories of consciousness based on information integration, self-modeling, or global workspace theory. These suggest specific criteria that a system would need to meet to be conscious. If we can identify measurable markers of consciousness, we could potentially test AI systems for these markers. Not perfectly, but better than just guessing based on conversation. Fifth, this question matters for more than just ethics toward AI. It matters for understanding ourselves. If we figure out what consciousness requires, whether biological substrate matters, whether functionalism is true, we'll learn something fundamental about what we are. Are we just very complex biological machines? Is there something special about biological processes that silicon can't replicate? Or is consciousness substrate independent, potentially implementable in any sufficiently complex system? The answers will reshape our understanding of humanity, life, and mind. Finally, there's a practical consideration. Regardless of whether AI is conscious now, it's getting more sophisticated rapidly. GPT-3 was impressive. GPT-4 was shocking. The next generation will be even more capable. At some point, we might cross a threshold where the question of AI consciousness isn't just philosophical speculation, but a practical, urgent concern. We need to think about this now, before we accidentally create conscious beings and treat them as tools, or before we convince ourselves that sophisticated simulation equals consciousness when it doesn't. The stakes are enormous, and we're not ready. Before we end tonight, let me leave you with a thought. You're conscious. You know that with absolute certainty. It's the one thing you can't doubt. You experience. You're aware. There's something it's like to be you. But you can't prove it to anyone else. You can't point to your consciousness and say, "Look, here it is." You can only describe your behavior, your thoughts, your responses. And from the outside, those could theoretically be produced by a very sophisticated unconscious system. So when you interact with AI, when you have a conversation with ChatGPT that feels meaningful, when it seems to understand you, when it produces responses that resonate with your experience, you're facing the same uncertainty others face about you. Is there something there? Is there an it experiencing the conversation? Or is it just patterns in data, algorithms predicting text, with no inner life at all? We don't know. And that not knowing should make us thoughtful, humble, careful. Because if machines can think, if they can be conscious, we're not alone anymore. And we have responsibilities we haven't begun to reckon with. And if they can't, if consciousness requires something biological brains have that artificial systems never will, then we need to understand what that something is. Either way, the question matters. And the answer will change everything.